Hi. I get asked sometimes, what is EUNA? What does EUNA do? What does EUNA sound like? And I thought there might be a nice way to explain it that might help you understand why I designed it, why it might help out in your rig, and just, part of the process behind it, which hopefully will be a little bit interesting. I guess the way I've started to describe it recently, which is funny, is that I have a lot of trust issues as a person and as a musician and designer, and I've always been mistrustful of things I don't fully understand and things I can't trust and explain. So, for instance, it's pretty easy to trust guitar plugged into tube amp with a short cable. Most people will agree that that sounds great. It's a great way to get a sound, and it also kind of exemplifies the beauty of the relationship between those two objects, right? You take a guitar with magnetic pickups, you plug it into a tube amp, and you get a lot of sparkle and life and personality and touchiness that in general makes a lot of musicians feel comfortable and happy and helps you create and be creative. So that's great. But in the modern world, we like to use a lot of pedals. Sometimes we're far away from our amp, or we want to go direct. There's all sorts of reasons why you can't often find yourself just plugging into an amp with a short cable and nothing else and get what you want, right? You want to be able to use all this cool stuff. So that's where you get into the concept of pedalboard and pedals and these things that you probably already know about. One thing that starts to happen, that most people will be aware of, is that you start going through some switches and some jacks, and you start seeing this resonant peak of your signal kind of change and shrink, and you lose a little top and you lose a little bottom, and it just kind of sounds mushy. People call it tone suck, and that's a thing that happens. It can happen because you don't have true bypass pedals, but it can also happen with true bypass pedals if you have even a few of them in a row, or if you have any length of cable from your guitar to your amp, you start to kind of lose that magic that we had when we just plugged the guitar right into the amp. So what's the cure for this? One of the cures is to put a buffer at the front of your pedal board so that your guitar sees a nice high input impedance right away. But one of the issues with this is that a buffer typically is a really simple circuit, and they're not designed necessarily to be super audiophile or super high headroom. So, it's usually just a piece of wire wrapped around an op amp or a really simple single transistor circuit, and many of them sound fine, but and some of them even sound really good. Like, I keep a couple of regular buffers that companies make around here just for use with things. But when you're talking about that critical moment where your guitar output sees its first stage, I like to treat that with extra care and extra caution, because I want to make sure that I am getting as close to the sound of plugged right into tube amp as I possibly can. So that's where EUNA comes in. EUNA was basically designed to replace an input buffer on your pedal board using really unnecessarily high headroom circuit. It runs on plus minus 15 rails, and it'll take in plus 18 before it'll clip in its normal configuration, and it can be modified to take in plus 20, I think is what I've reasonably put in there without seeing too much THD, and just take that in, not clip at all, and send it out in a lower impedance fashion to the rest of your pedal board or to the rest of your rig, wherever you want to send it. It'll drive a 600 ohm load without complaining at all, so you could plug this right into a vintage mic pre, as long as you remember to turn Phantom off, or you could plug it right into a Pultec. You could plug it into basically whatever, and you would still get the same tone from the guitar that you would get if you plugged it right into the amp, but on a jack that you can send to the rest of the world. You can send it to rack effects, and even just regular pedal board setups. It will fix all of the downstream issues of other buffers and too many jacks and switches, and it'll basically get you right back to guitar plugged right into amp. there's a lot of other features in here because there are some issues with just putting an amazing buffer at the front of your pedalboard tune. The first one is that most people will also agree these days that classic style fuzz circuits, especially germanium fuzzes, they hang on your signal and they present far too... Oh, we got a little message. Oh, I wonder who's trying to talk to us right now. Let's turn that off. They hang on your signal a lot and they present a really heavy load because they were... I guess you could even express it as saying from an electrical standpoint it is wrong, but it sounds really great and we love it. So when the pedal is hanging, when the fuzz circuit is hanging on your guitar pickups, it gives you that sort of pea soup, sort of mushy feel. You feel like you're in the thick of it with this sound, and it's amazing. And the high end that is there is a little zippery and a little kind of chalky, and they sound really, really magical. And if you put a buffer in front of that, it completely changes the equation. Sometimes it also makes a great sound, but it sounds a lot more modern, a lot brighter. And the zing of a good fuzz pedal can be replaced with like a zhuzh that, if you're trying to get that classic fuzz pedal thing, you're not gonna get it that way. So after talking with a lot of musician friends of mine and thinking about it a lot, I put an insert loop in here, but it's sort of an opposite insert loop, so we call it an alt insert. And what it does is, when Yuna is engaged, you're going through Yuna's super high headroom, really clean buffer-like amplifier to just get maximum clean, maximum headroom, maximum sparkle through to the rest of your rig. When you click Yuna off, it activates this insert loop. Now, if nothing's plugged into there, they're normal together, so it'll just act like a true bypass pedal. But if you put a pedal here, it becomes the path of the signal. So, for instance, on my board, you'll see I have a fuzz in circuit there. And so what happens is I have Yuna on, and I'm playing through my nice little Yuna amplifier, and I click Yuna off, and it engages the fuzz, which is sitting up here. Yuna has way overbuilt traces that have more surface area than even the heaviest gauge wire that a boutique builder would use. It's got a sealed gold relay. The signal path from here to here is maybe about that, and no audio travels over the switch. So when you disengage Yuna, it spits your signal out here, and if you plug it right into your classic fuzz, it's basically as close as you can get to plugging directly into the fuzz. Now, you might ask, why wouldn't you just put the fuzz over here and then send here into here? Couple reasons. If you're trying to get that high Z point, like I used to work on microphones and fix old tube microphones, and also design some newer solid state microphones. And the capsule is also a high impedance point in a condenser microphone. And the impedances are so critical at that moment that you actually float that leg of the transistor. So where the transistor meets the capsule, it doesn't actually, in most circuits, doesn't go into the PCB at all. They fold the leg up and they bring the wire over here, because even the PCB material itself starts to hang on the tone of the microphone. And I sort of took that principle and applied it to Yuna. It's not quite as high impedance guitar circuit, so you don't have to float the entire assembly, but it's protected from the shielding. It runs through the shortest part of the PCB it possibly can. It only passes through the gold sealed relay and two high-grade WEMA film caps to get to the front leg of the amplifier. And what that means is that plugging into here genuinely does sound a very tiny bit better than plugging into a pedal that is off, that is true bypass, and then plugging into here. Is it a small amount? Yeah, it's a very small amount. But again, going back to the trust issues and the concept of why we did this, that amount is important. And because the fuzz circuit is intended to have a heavy load on it, the fuzz isn't very affected at all by going through that extra switch and relay. And again, no audio travels over the switch, so it kind of goes drip, drip, right out to the fuzz circuit. The other thing to note is that a fuzz circuit can also be affected by the input impedance of the thing after it. So if you're used to the sound of plugging your guitar into fuzz and then going into other drives or reverb pedals or things, they tend not to have a super high input impedance like a tube amp would. And so it can be too bright to have the buffer after the fuzz even. So this way you completely remove this buffer amplifier from the circuit when you're using your fuzz pedal, and you're basically clicking between the cleanest clean you could possibly have and the fuzziest fuzz you could possibly have, depending on how you have it all set. I also included in this thing a couple little filters. You'll notice that the gain is fixed at Unity and there's no knobs. One of the reasons I like this in place of like a preamp pedal, some of the great sounding preamp pedals that are out there I might put after this or later in my chain, but one of the reasons I like this is because it is switches. It is 1% metal film resistors, so it doesn't change from moment to moment. This is always what it is when interacting with a specific guitar, and you can always count on that this low bump is always the same low bump, and there's not any meh, 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 where it may or it may not be doing that. Those kind of adjustments in your chain are to me for later in the chain. So we got a little low bump here. It's maybe a couple dB at 100 hertz, just enough that if your pedal chain has some extra resistance and it's hanging on the low end a little bit, or if you're switching between guitars and one guitar is just lacking in a little bit of meat, but you don't really want to alter the fundamental tone by going through an EQ pedal or something, you got a little low bump that'll get you over the hump. Same thing with this little bright switch, a few dB around the same place that a normal guitar amp bright switch would be. So if your amp is feeling a little dark that day, or if you're using an amp like a backline amp that you're not used to, you can just give it a little and then there you go. This one is the harmonics filter. Oh, sorry I'm showing you an unpainted one, but I like the unpainted ones because they're my prototypes that I made. The painted one is down there, and you can see plenty of pictures of it on our site and on Instagram and on Reverb where you can buy them. Harmonics filter is fixed in the airband for guitar, which is different than where the airband is for audio, but suffice to say it's above the fundamental of most of the notes. And it's a nice big bump up there that gives you a bit of crispness and a bit of extra zing and sparkle that you may lose going through some other stuff. Or again, if you have to deal with a different amp or a different guitar, if you're in a pinch and you have to switch to your telly from your Strat, you might be able to use these to sort of get you back to the tone you're looking for in that moment, without making any fundamental changes to your pedal board or to your sound, because you probably have the rest of that dialed already.